The night pressed against the concrete like a living weight, the air inside the cell thick with chlorine and rot, the kind of blend that climbs up your throat and tastes like a slow drowning. Men lay on steel bunks with their eyes open and unblinking, as if closing them would invite a hand to smother their breath. I lay on the lower rack with my face turned to the wall, counting the hairline cracks that ran like rivers into the darkness. My name outside had been Mateo, but inside names were a rumor. Numbers spoke louder than names. I was Unit 734, the number rasped by guards, the number scrawled into inventory sheets, the number tattooed by a buzzing needle that smelled like hot copper on the day the helicopter door opened and the earth fell away. All of us delivered to the Center for the Confinement of Terrorism. CECOT, a cathedral of concrete that rose from the scrub like a monolith and swallowed the sky. The rumors said no one left. The rumors said even a scream could not find the gate. The rumors said the wall had teeth. I did not know about the wall, but I knew the teeth because they sat in the mouths of men who smiled when they heard footsteps after lights out. They sat in the mouths of guards who whispered the word training like a prayer. The teeth were everywhere. The first day unfolded in a single pale tone, as if color were illegal. We were herded into a corridor that hummed through the soles of our feet. Fluorescent lamps blinked and licked our shiktidu until they looked like holes tearing loose from our bodies. The guards wore visors that hid their eyes, each visor a dark mirror. You could look inside and see yourself thinner, weaker, a version that might not survive the afternoon. In that corridor, I saw the men who would shape the next days. First was Toro, a thick-necked man with a broken ear and a soft way of speaking. He had run guns in Sonsonate and never raised his voice. He said the quiet voice was for when the room felt like a matchbox. He said, "Fire liked quiet men." Second was El Nino, a thin man with fingers like piano wire and a faded ring tattooed around his left thumb. He had been a thief and a messenger and a ghost who walked between crews when war bloomed. He said, peace was a word for men who never listened at doors. Third was Izalco, who took his name from a volcano and told us his father had dug bodies in the ash. When the mountain coughed, his eyes were calm and old, and he washed his hands after every touch. Last in the line was a man who did not speak all morning. He stared at the floor as if reading a text written in dust. His jumpsuit said Canto, but a guard told me later that the man had been called Sombra, the shadow, the kind of man who entered a room and came out alone. We were a crooked choir, and CECOT would be our hymn. By evening, the routine had already cut grooves in us. You wake, you line up, you move, you eat a meal that tastes like wet paper and metal shavings. You breathe, you listen for the sound that does not belong. The guards called it discipline training, the way a farmer might describe a weather pattern. At lights out, the block sank into a gray hush, not silence. There is never silence in a place that compresses blood and fear into a single frequency. There is breath, there is the shift of weight, there is the whisper that begins with no mouth. I heard it that first night, a lilt like a child tracing letters on glass. I thought it was a man 2 bunks over practicing his prayers with his face inside a shirt. I listened harder, and the voice slipped past me. It spoke behind my ear, then in my chest. The words were simple and flat. The words said 13. The words said 13 again. The words said, "A door is not a door if it never opens." The bunk creaked as I sat up and looked across the dim aisle. The cell opposite ours was sealed, no window, just a plate of steel welded over a frame. Toro saw me looking and shook his head. "Not now," he mouthed. He lifted his palm. He drew a circle on his skin. The signal for later, for safe air, for a place where walls did not grow ears. Morning came like a wound that refuses to close. In the yard, men shuffled in narrow loops, while towers watched through glass blacker than oil. The sky above the far wall looked like a memory of ocean, and smelled like nothing. Nino walked beside me and touched his thumb to his ring finger, as if reminding himself that he still had both hands. He spoke without moving his mouth. He said, "The sealed cell belonged to a man named Rivas, a lieutenant of a crew that had tried to run extortion through the prison laundry. The story went that Rivas fell asleep and never woke. The story went that in the morning, his cell was colder than the corridor. The story went that when the gate opened to collect the body, the steel handle burned a white brand into the glove of the man who touched it. I told Nino that stories were ways of naming fear. He nodded and said yes, and fear likes to hear its own name. We both looked at the towers, two specks of motion behind one visor, one speck behind another. He shifted his feet as if listening to ground thunder. He said, "There is more," he said. "Last week, a guard named Silva opened the door to 13 and saw water puddled on the floor. But the air was dry and the water moved against the slope like a blister. Climbing the skin, Silva went on leave the next door, and now he is not on the roster. Maybe he found a new job. Maybe he found a hole to lie in. And here, those are similar outcomes. That afternoon, our block got the kind of gift that is never wrapped." The loudspeaker coughed and named 8 numbers. Men in our row tensed as if bracing for knives. My number was called 734, along with Toro and Nino and Izalco and Canto, and 2 boys fresh enough to still flinch when a door banged shut. The 8th number belonged to a guard. The loudspeaker said, "Evaluation detail." The men around us breathed a hiss at once. Evaluation detail meant an errand into the guts of the place. It meant walking a part of the prison you do not see on the stage tours and in the polished videos. It meant a chance to vanish between cameras, or to come back altered. We were cuffed in a chain and led down a ramp that smelled of mice and stagnant air. A heavy sliding door opened, and we stepped into a service tunnel that seemed to run under every conversation ever spoken in the prison. Our boots clanked, our breath fogged. The guard at the head of the line wore no name patch, only a number that looked like a date. He walked with the bored gait of a man who had seen an earthquake and found it acceptable. He did not look at us. He spoke into a lapel mic, and doors opened in front of his shadow. We entered a vaulted room where pipes threaded the ceiling like black roots. The guard pointed us to a wall and told us to scrub. He said we would scrub until the color of the concrete changed. He said the color would change when it remembered it was clean. The words were flat, but the boys trembled as if they had been sentenced to wash a coastline with a cup. We scrubbed, my hands blistered, and in the rhythm of brush and rinse, a quiet settled that felt like the underside of a lake. I listened to the scrape of bristles, to the drip of a faulty flange, to the repeated phrase in my head, 13, 13, 13. I told myself, the mind can trap itself with a single nail. Nino leaned with his shoulder and brushed a patch of lime that had bloomed like frost. He said, "This wall sweats on days it should not," he said. "The sweat tastes sweet," he said. "Do not ask how I know the taste," Toro grunted. He said, "Walls do not sweat. Men do," he said. "Some men are walls." Canto spoke for the first time, his voice thin but steady. He said, "The room remembers what the pipes carry." He said, "If blood went through here, once the room learned the cadence, he said the room keeps time, even when we do not." The guard glanced over without moving his neck, as if he had heard the word blood and catalogued it. There was a moment like a coin on an edge, and then the guard looked away, as if the coin had fallen and rolled under a shelf. We were returned to the block with our knuckles split and our minds humming. That night the whisper returned. It threaded through the bunks like a draft. I heard it, and I knew from the twitch of shoulders in the row that others did too. The voice said the same number. And then it changed. It said, "Open." It said the word that in a prison is shaped like a blade. Open. And then my heart slowed, because I realized the word was not for the door itself. The word was inside a sentence that did not need any more parts. Open and take the breath. I sat up again, and Zalko opened his eyes without moving his head. He said, "Do not feed it." He said, "It grows on your answer." He said, "It will become your mirror." The whisper thinned, and for a moment I believed we had resisted. But the smell in the room turned like milk, a sweet rot. 3 bunks down, a boy gagged and whimpered into his sheet. Toro slid from his rack and pressed a palm to the boy's forehead. The boy shivered like a guitar string and said, "Open," in a voice that belonged to something without lungs. We watched the boy labor for breath while the whisper seemed to hold him down, and then it let go. The boy sobbed and then went empty. A guard clanged a baton on the bars and told us to sleep. Sleep as if we could hang our heads on hooks and leave them there. By the 3rd day, we understood what kind of place CECOT wanted to be. Not only a cage for flesh, but a device to tune the soul to a frequency the architects preferred. There was talk of experiments and programs, of a schedule that never aligned with clocks, of a corridor where lights went on at the wrong hour, so the brain would learn a new darkness. A man in the corner with a haircut from the army days said he had built walls once. He said he knew the sound of conduit when it carried more than electricity. He put his ear to the concrete and said he heard water. Then he corrected himself. "Not water," he said. Footsteps, but smaller, like a child stepping inside a box. That same afternoon, a fight broke in the laundry. 2 crews jostled over folded stacks and rancid soap. The fight ended with the man slashed from eyebrow to ear by a sharpened handle. The guards came slow, as if letting a lesson bloom. The injured man turned his face toward the floor drain and whispered 13 with his blood. Then he laughed as the guards dragged him out, as if he had heard a joke delivered inside his skull. At mealtime, a guard with a quiet face stopped at our table. He set down a tray that was not ours. It held half a mango, a rare color in this place. He did not look at us. He said, "Eat," and he walked on. Later in the yard, he passed by again and let a coin slip from his fist near the drain. The coin hit the grate and made a small bell, like a tiny door opening. Nino watched the guard until he disappeared behind a pillar. He said, "That man is not like the others." He said his boots do not tap in step. He said his face has too much memory. Toro said, "No one gives fruit unless they want your face to turn in their direction." I asked him if we should avoid the gaze or take it straight. He said, "That depends on whether you want to drink poison or pour it on the ground." That night, we lay awake too long, and finally the guard with the quiet face returned. He walked the row as if counting breaths. He stopped where the light died on the wall. He spoke as if musing to himself. He said, "A cell is a claim." He said, "A number is not a name." He said, 13 used to be a place for a man, and now it is a place for a noise." He said, "The cameras near that door erase a second every minute," he said. "A man can hide a lot in a second." His voice was barely more than breath. He moved again before the towers could fix a bead on him, and he left a folded slip under Toro mattress. We did not open it until the lights leaned heavier and the corridor went to ash. The paper contained a map drawn in a hand that trembled. Only a little the line showed a path from our block to a service corridor, to a maintenance stair that climbed behind a duct. The path ended at a hex where a circle had been drawn and shaded. The page held 2 words beneath the shape: storm valve, and one more: midnight. We stared until the edges blurred. Toro said a map is a promise and a threat. Nino said a map is also a confession. Zalco said the handwriting belonged to a man who had trained himself to write in small spaces. Canto said it belonged to a man who did not care if he lived through the night. We folded the page and burned it above the toilet with a smuggled match that smelled like rain on copper. We memorized the stroke of each turn. We each found a way to believe that our feet could follow those strokes in the real world, where boots squeak and cameras are hungry. In the bunk above me, the boy who had whispered open earlier lay still, his breath like paper. I told myself he would be fine, and the whisper told me not to lie to myself and used my own voice to say it. We moved the next night, not midnight, earlier by an hour, because clocks are clocks only when you bow to them. The guard with the quiet face passed our row and dropped his keys without pausing. He bent to pick them up and leaned longer than he needed to, and in that long second the camera above the gate went to snow. We slipped through with a scuff that could have been a rat. Nino led, his hands remembering doors they had never touched. Toro followed with a posture like a wall, pretending to be a man. Izalco counted vents. Canto drifted like a shadow with an echo. I brought up the rear, marking corners with my pulse. We passed the sealed cell. The steel plate sweated in a way that made my throat salivate. The air in front of the plate felt cold enough to blister. The whisper rose to a chorus, not numbers now, images pressed into sound. The snap of a cord, the click of a latch, the lagging drip of something thicker than water. Nino touched the plate and hissed through his teeth. He said, "The metal is thirsty." We moved on. The service corridor welcomed us like a throat, welcoming a swallowed object. The air tasted like old rubber. We reached the maintenance stair, which doubled back on itself tighter than a coiled spring. At the landing there was a valve wheel, flaking paint the color of smoked bone. The circle of our map, storm valve. Toro closed his hands on the wheel and heaved. The wheel did not move. He heaved again, and his jaw stood out white. The wheel chirped and then rolled a quarter turn. Somewhere in the building, a deep sound changed from one note to another. The sound of air learning a new path. The sound of pressure, negotiating with itself. Canto whispered that some doors do not knock when they open. They sigh. Nino held the stair rail and listened. He said the towers just lost their faces for a second, he said. The cameras near the yard are blind for a breath, he said. Go. And then boots rang above us, and a guard voice called numbers that were not ours, and the stair vibrated with a rhythm we did not like. We sank into the dark beside the duct, and in that lean space I smelled wet cotton and something older, something like a basement where no feet have stood for a century. We held our bodies thin. The guards passed. 2, then one more. The last one hesitated, as if a smell had turned his head, then went on. And the duct whispered our names in a voice that had never heard them before. We reached the corridor that ran behind the laundry. The map had not shown every bend, we guessed, and we lucked and we listened. Toro marked a corner with a smear from his scraped knuckle. The blood looked more alive than we did. Then the whisper rose like steam, not from 13, but from the floor itself. The tiles sweated, and our souls slid a little. We stopped, and the air sharpened as if a blade had tasted it. The boy from our row stepped from a side hall and stood in front of us with a smile that did not belong to a human. His eyes were white at the edges and empty at the center. He said, open in a tone that wanted to be gentle. Then he said, take the breath. Then he said, the door is not a door. And he looked at Canto as if recognizing a twin. Canto shook his head once. He said, you are not the boy. He said, give him back. And the boy said, He is somewhere he cannot drown. And then he turned and walked through a pipe chase where no human could fit, as if the wall had softened for him. We waited until the tile dried, and then we moved on with legs that had lost some of their certainty. The exit we aimed for was not the gate. We were not foolish. We aimed for a chamber with a service hatch that opened above a drainage canal that fed to a culvert that slid under a road. We aimed for a place where the world had made a habit of being wet and would not notice 4 men more. The hatch would require a tool we did not carry, but the quiet guard had promised a crowbar and a coil of towels. When we reached the chamber, the towels were there, the crowbar wrapped like a bone inside a muffler. We opened the hatch with a groan that echoed like a prayer from the bottom of a well. Air that had never been on a human tongue brushed our faces. The canal was a black stripe with a slow pulse. Then a red light painted the wall. A tower beam cut the chamber in half. We froze with our arms drawn like tight strings. The beam rose and fell, as if nodding, and then left. We slipped into the canal and let the water accept us. The current was lazy, but it carried us away from the central stem of the building. We moved with our chins, chin deep. We came to a grill that did not belong to the map. The bars were new, the welds bright, and in the darkness we saw 3 strands of hair fused into the seam, as if the metal had eaten a head and kept a souvenir. Nino held the crowbar and put his weight on the crosspiece. It squealed like a child, and we flinched. The whisper answered from the water, and I tasted iron in my teeth. Toro braced the crowbar. I pushed with mine. The bar bent, and a weld cracked like ice. The gap widened. One by one we slid through. The water slowed, and we rose into a pocket where we could breathe without tasting the floor. We did not find the culvert gate, because men in suits had already been there with their diagrams and their calculations. The route was not open in the world the map had wanted. So we made another map while shivering. We found a slot where the water ran like a bad thought. We found a ladder sealed behind a wire cage. We pulled on the cage and it gave like a scab. We climbed into a closet that smelled of bleach and resignation. We opened the interior door half an inch and watched a guard doze in a plastic chair with his head bent. The quiet guard stood in the hall, a dozen paces away with a clipboard. He did not look at us. He spoke to the sleeping man about a shipment that would arrive at dawn. He spoke in the voice of a man who has always worked in the same corridor and will always work in it. And then he let a pen fall, and when he bent, his eyes flicked to the closet and to the ceiling, and to the right he was drawing a line in the air that told us where to move. We followed that invisible line and came to a window that should not have existed in a corridor like this, a slit too narrow for a body, but wide enough for an arm. Outside the slit, the night lay against the wall like a second skin. The quiet guard walked away with steps that did not show hurry. We breathed in and out, tasting a flavor that was almost hope. The alarm burst without sound, because we were already inside the loudest sound there is, the hum of a building that wants to erase mistakes. Lights shifted from white to a white that your eyes translate as red. Doors that always open closed, and doors that always close went into an idea of open that you could not touch. Men shouted numbers in a rhythm that sounded like a prayer for the deaf. We retreated into the closet and pulled the door. The whisper entered with us as if it had been there first. It said 13 again, and then it said, "Do not count." We waited while the closet shrank and the shelves pressed against our ribs. Someone in the hall recited a list of cleaning solutions, as if it were a menu. The quiet guard said, "Check the laundry, check the vents, check the waste chutes." He did not say, "Check the closet," but a second guard did. The knob rattled and stopped. The bolt held. The second guard grunted and moved on. My knees shook and my teeth touched each other without permission. Canto put his palm on the thin metal and closed his eyes. He said in a voice that did not carry, That the wall behind 13 is not only a wall, he said. There is a passage there, he said. I dreamed it when I slept with my ear to the steel. He said the passage is not for bodies. He said it is for ideas. He said ideas can walk. We stared at him in the dark. We believed him, because belief and oxygen were the same. In that minute, when the alarm resolved into normal hum, we left the closet and moved back into the belly of the building. Our hope for the canal had emptied. Our map had curled its edges and burned, and yet the line of our feet still pointed forward, toward the place where the world thinned, toward 13. Not because we wanted to open what was behind it, but because there was a debt there and a measure to be taken. We walked the service spine and felt the breath of fans that turned like giant lungs for a stone body. We paused at a hatch where heat breathed like a dog. Nino said if we can reach the power control, we can false dawn the cameras, he said. A minute of stun would be enough to slide into the chapel, he said. From the chapel, a crawl vents to the kitchens, and the kitchens have a dock where deliveries arrive in the dark, he said. I have ridden under a truck before. It is like being a comma in a sentence. You hang there, and you hope the sentence does not end with a period. His image made me smile without relaxing. We followed his plan in miniature. We did not make it as far as the chapel. We made it to a junction where pipes rattled like bones and where a painted number on the wall said 13, in a hand that belonged to no man who worked here. We stopped, and the temperature dropped as if a season had entered through a crack. Our breath smoked. The paint on the pipes took on a shine, as if wet. The whisper came clear and loud, like a voice at your shoulder. It said you should have opened when you had the chance. It said, now you will open without a hand. The wall to our right flexed. The brick showed a ripple that should have belonged to a pond. Nino choked. Toro did not move. Izalco closed his eyes and counted in his head. Canto smiled like a child who has found a toy behind a stove. I touched the wall, and it was not cold. It was the temperature of my palm. The ripple subsided, and the paint dried in an instant. The whisper withdrew, as if embarrassed. We continued with our legs, remembering other lives. We found the edge of the laundry and heard men arguing over the count of folded sheets and the weight of wet mats. The voice I wanted to trust did not appear. The quiet guard was absent, but his absence spoke. It said, do not make me your plan. It said, be your own blunt instrument. So we turned back toward the block, not because the block was safe, but because we had left something there we could not carry with us. Maybe it was the boy. Maybe it was the version of ourselves who had not moved yet. When we returned to the row, our bunks were as we had left them, except for the boy bed, which was empty, the sheet folded as if by a nurse. On the sheet a small circle had been drawn with what looked like salt. Inside the circle a figure had been scratched with a nail, a child stick, arms and legs and a round head, the eyes aligned with the nail scratches on the steel under the sheet. An accidental design, except not accidental. Izalco bent and blew the circle, and it did not move, as if the salt had grown roots. Toro brushed it with his knuckle and shuddered. He said this place wants a story. He said we are telling it. He said it wants a sacrifice. He did not say whether we had already given it or not. That night, I slept a little and dreamed I walked a corridor lit by lamps that swung as if a giant breathed in the dream. 13 stood open and empty, and inside was a staircase that went down into a well of air, and the air smelled like mango and smoke, and at the bottom of the stairs there was a man who looked like me, but without my scars, he said. Do not open, he said. Take the breath, he said. Drink it instead. I woke with big tongue tasting metal. The lights were gray, the day not yet born. The whisper quiet for once, as if it had spent the night speaking to another man somewhere else. The next day, the block changed its rhythm. Men moved in tensed patterns, guards flowed like oil. A rumor said a transfer convoy would arrive at dusk. Another rumor said an inspection from the capital would stroll the halls and bless the pipes. A third rumor said a priest would perform a cleansing rite. In 13, we laughed at the third, then stopped laughing, because a laugh is a hard sound to carry. In a place that wants soft movements, the quiet guard appeared again at midday and looked tired. He stood at the end of the row and watched us with a gaze that did not ask for anything. He said, without moving his lips, "Not tonight." He traced a small square in the air, then another. As if stacking two rooms, he was telling us about a reflection, a room above a room, a ceiling that mirrored a floor. I realized the maintenance stair had one flight too many on the map. I realized we had climbed into a space that wanted us to believe we had reached the top. I realized the storm valve might have a twin, a second circle somewhere else. I realized he was telling us to look up when we wanted to look down, and then he was gone. Called by the radio on his shoulder, swallowed by a corner as clean as a blade. Dusk slid its blade through the sky. The convoy arrived with quiet tires, no sirens, no trumpet of power. The towers watched, the gates accepted, and a string of vehicles bled men into the intake hall. We stood on our marks and pretended to be furniture. The priest rumor turned out to wear a uniform, not a cassock. He walked with a clipboard and a spine straight enough to be a threat. He stopped at 13 and pressed his palm to the steel and frowned. He moved on. A boy in the new line made the sign of a cross with two fingers and then swallowed it, as if the air did not allow the gesture to live. The night came in full. The block sank a fraction deeper into the ground, and the whisper returned with a new voice inside it. A woman this time, or a man borrowing a woman lilt. It said the name Rivas without weight. It said the word son. It said forgive. And when it said that last word, the concrete shivered, as if the idea had a temperature. The mix had not been designed to bear. Toro sat with his back to the bars and rubbed the broken ear that always ached when pressure changed. And he said this place was built to channel something we do not understand. He said the men who poured the foundations left more than footprints in the mud, and in that moment, I believed him, more than I believed my own memory of the day I arrived in the helicopter. Belly with a hood over my head and the black of the world tight against my teeth. We decided, because a decision can be a raft, to try again when the inspection team slept. To look for the second valve the quiet guard had drawn in the air with his imaginary chalk. To look up rather than down. To climb. Not to lower ourselves into water and pipe and grate, but to rise into a spine of lightless air and old dust. Where the cameras would be lazy and the heat would not care, we marked the time by the cough of the night shift coffee. We moved when the cough turned to the long swallow of a man who wishes he were not awake. We slipped out with the same borrowed second we had used before. We made for a service corridor that ran behind the chapel, where the brick had been painted a pale tan to imitate warmth, where a line of vents clicked like teeth in a mouth. Rehearsing a smile, we found a hatch above a cabinet. We climbed into a crawl space that smelled like old paper and mouse fur. The roof above us sagged and creaked. The beams ahead were dark with old leaks. We followed them to a rectangle of shade that was darker than the rest, and there we found a wheel, not painted, but raw and rusted, a twin to the storm valve below. We put our hands on it and felt a hum like a small heart. We turned it, slowly, and the building replied with a sigh that seemed to come from a place under the world, and a panel in front of us clicked and slid an inch, and behind it lay a ladder, and at the top of the ladder, a hatch, and behind the hatch, a smell we could not place. We opened the hatch, a finger, and found ourselves above 13, Not beside it, not before it, above it. Like an eye in a ceiling, the room beneath was a cell, and not a cell. It had dimensions a human would recognize, but the walls were layered with something that caught the light and refused to reflect it. The floor was marked with rings scratched by men or by metal chairs. The center held a drain that sat like a mouth. The air inside moved, but not because of fans. It moved as if breathing. We watched while the whisper thrummed, and a shape entered the room. A guard with a quiet face, carrying a small bowl. He set the bowl on the floor near the drain and stepped back. He waited. The whisper coiled around him, and his shoulders drooped. He spoke a few words that had no punctuation, only commas and periods, as if he were one of us. He said, "This is the last time." He said, "Take it and leave." He said, "I have given enough." Then the air sharpened, and the bowl slid a finger width on the concrete by itself, and a sound like a child blowing across the top of a bottle filled the room. The guard took a breath that seemed to snag on hooks. Then he straightened and left, and the bowl boiled without heat, and the room exhaled. We looked at each other with faces that had run out of ordinary expressions. We did not speak, not because of fear, but because nothing we could say would be language. Canto looked down into 13 with a softness that made him look younger. He whispered that the room is a throat. He whispered that they feed it names, and it feeds them order. He whispered that the guard had made a bargain. Toro closed his eyes and nodded, as if accepting a price that had already been deducted from his account. Nino did not move at all, because thieves learn to hold still when the world wants them to be seen. I felt a line inside me pull tight, the kind of line that runs from the chest to the mouth and decides what you will be when the next moment arrives. We could climb down into 13, and maybe we would find the stair from my dream. Or maybe we would find a room that would swallow our ankles and our tongues. We could withdraw and declare an end to maps and valves and hatches. We could return to our bunks and wait for the convoy that would assign us to some other corridor where the whisper had a different hobby. Instead, we did a third thing. We slid the panel fully open. We lowered ourselves without touching the floor. We hung like commas in a sentence we had not finished writing, and we breathed, slow and even, because the whisper seemed to listen to breath the way a guard listens to footsteps in a hall. We shaped our breath to say we are not prey. We shaped our breath to say we are not meat. We shaped our breath to say we are men. And we play games too. The floor of 13 was cooler than the air, not cold, but preserved. As if memory had a temperature, we stood in a ring. Not because we planned a ritual, but because people are circles when they are afraid. The drain in the center seemed deeper than it should have been. My eyes tried to measure it and failed. On the wall opposite the hatch, someone had scratched a string of letters and numbers with something sharper than a spoon. The marks had been polished by many fingers. They read like a prayer. But I did not read them, because reading would put the words in me. The air pulsed once, and then again, and the whisper came from under the floor, and said a word I had not heard since the day my mother died. It said, my childhood name, the one only she used, and I wanted to kneel. I wanted to place my forehead on the concrete and confess. Toro put a hand on my shoulder and squeezed, and the pressure of his hand was the only weight that mattered. It told me where I was. It told me who I was. It told me the voice was a trick. The voice trashed as if disappointed. The bowl on the floor rocked, and a wetness formed inside it that did not come from any pipe we could see. Canto crouched and squinted and nodded. He said, the bargain is simple. He said, they bring memory, and the room gives them moments. He said the moments look like luck. They look like order during a riot. They look like a camera failing at the right time. They look like a storm, waiting until after a transfer. He said the room is an engine. Nino whispered that engines need fuel. He whispered that fuel runs out. He whispered that when fuel runs out, engines seize and catch fire. We heard boots in the corridor. The quiet guard was returning. Maybe with another bowl, maybe with a decision. We climbed back up with arms that shook. We closed the panel and wiped our fingerprints on our sleeves as if the walls had a database. We crawled back through the hot dust to the hatch and sealed the valve we had opened. The building breathed a different note and settled. We returned to the corridor and to our bunks, and we listened to the night discover our absence and decide to ignore it. In the morning, the convoy left with a lazy roll. The inspection team signed papers with plastic pens and dusted off their sleeves and drove away. 13 sat quiet. The drain dry, the bowl gone. The whisper slept inside a corner where the paint peeled. Toro flexed his hand and said, "Sometimes the game is not to break out. Sometimes the game is to change the rules." Nino agreed. He said, "If the room gives them order, then we can take it." He said, "We can tilt the board." He said, "We can draw new lines." Canto smiled and said, "A room that eats memory can also choke on it." He said, "We will feed it something it cannot swallow." He said, "We will feed it the memory of a man who is not here." We waited for him to tell us the name. He did not. Not then. He just closed his eyes and listened to the pipe. Hum, as if it were a song he had known once and forgotten days stacked, and we rehearsed the new plan without moving a muscle. The plan was a sentence with many commas. It moved, it paused, it moved again. It had no title, it was not a chapter. It was the line of a life in a place that counts lines. We watched the quiet guard and learned his pattern. We watched the towers and learned their blink. We listened to the whisper and learned its thirst. We saved our breath like coins. We kept our fear sharp, but not loud. We set the moment in the dark when the engine would misfire, and when that hour arrived, we did not ask for permission from fate or ghosts. We stood, we moved, we played our marks as if the block were a stage and the audience were blind. We turned the hidden wheel and opened the throat of 13. We brought a memory heavy enough to break a room, and as the air drew tight and the drain gasped like a mouth, we stepped inside with our palms turned, and the story leaned forward, and the wall listened, and the night began to change its mind about us, and somewhere in the building, a door that had never opened, let light touch the floor for the first time in its life.